Mateo Kapitulo 24 versikulo 4 hanggang 5. Sumagot si Jesus, mag-ingat kayo upang hindi kayo mailigaw ni Limon. Maraming paparito sa pangalan ko at magpapanggap na sila ang Kristo, at marami silang maililigaw. Mateo Kapitulo 24 versikulo 11. Marami ang magpapanggap na propeta at ililigaw ang mga tao. Mateo Kapitulo 24 versikulo 24. Sapagkat may lilito na mga huwad na Mesiyas at mga huwad na propeta. Magpapakita sila ng mga kamanghamanghang himala at mga kababalaghan upang iligaw ang marami kahit na ang mga hinirang ng Diyos. Narito ang ilan sa mga iglesyang gumagamit sa pangalang Kristo, upang gamitin sa panliligaw sa mga tao.
Church of Christ in Congo. The Church of Christ in the Congo, or CCC, is a union of 62 Protestant denominations, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Within the Democratic Republic of the Congo, it is often simply referred to as the Protestant Church, as it federates the vast majority of the Protestants in that country with members of 25.5 million. The union has its origins in a grouping of different Protestant and evangelical churches by missionaries that took place in 1902. It was officially founded in 1924 as the Protestant Council of Congo, CPC. In 1934, it took the name of Church of Christ in Congo. Church of Christ in Thailand. The Church of Christ in Thailand, CCT, Thai, Svakristkakernapratesthi, is a Protestant Christian association. It is the largest Protestant denomination in Thailand and is considered to be the largest by group of Protestant members in Thailand that founded in 1934. Iglesia Ni Cristo, Church of Christ. Iglesia Ni Cristo, Church of Christ, is an independent non-Trinitarian Christian church, founded in 1913 and registered by Felix Y. Manalo in 1914 as an unipersonal religious corporation to the United States Administration of the Philippines, and also registered in the SEC, or Securities and Exchange Commissions, in the Republic of the Philippines. The INC describes itself to be the one true church and the restoration of the original church founded by Jesus, whereby all other Christian churches are apostate. According to INC doctrine, by Felix Y. Manalo, who is upheld by members to be the last messenger of God, was an act of divine providence and the fulfillment of biblical prophecy concerning the re-establishment of the original Church of Christ in the Far East, concurrent with the coming of the seventh seal, marking the end of days. By the time of Manilo's death in 1963, INC had become a nationwide church with 1,250 local chapels and 35 cathedrals. As his successor, Manilo's son, Aranyoji Manalo, led a campaign to grow and internationalize the church until his death on August 31, 2009. His son, Eduardo V. Manalo, succeeded him as executive minister. The 2015 Philippine census reported that 2,664,498 of the population's religious affiliation was with the church. United Church of Christ in the Philippines, UCCP. The United Church of Christ in the Philippines is a Christian Protestant denomination in the Philippines, founded and originated on April 26, 1901, officially on May 25, 1948, with estimated of 1,500,000 members. Established in its present form in Malate, Manila, it resulted from the merger of the Evangelical Church of the Philippines, the Philippine Methodist Church, the Disciples of Christ, the United Evangelical Church, and several independent congregations. Chairman, Heath Arley D. Kebro. Congregations, 2,564, estimate as of 2008, General Secretary, Bishop Melzar Labuntog. United Church of Christ in Marshall Islands. The United Church of Christ, founded in 1972, Congregational in the Marshall Islands, is a Protestant Christian church in the Marshall Islands. With approximately 40,000 members, the UCCCMI is the largest religious group in the Marshall Islands, accounting for about 55% of the population. The UCCCMI has its roots in the Christian missionary activity begun in the Marshall Islands in 1857 by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which established Congregationalist churches across the islands. In 1957, when the United Church of Christ was organized in the United States, the churches in the Marshall Islands were part of this church. The UCCCMI became autonomous of the American Church in 1972 and adopted its present name. United Church of Christ in United States of America. The United Church of Christ, UCC, is a mainline Protestant Christian denomination based in the United States, with historical and confessional roots in the Congregational, Calvinist, Lutheran, and Anabaptist traditions, and with approximately 4,794 churches and 773,539 members. The United Church of Christ is a historical continuation of the General Council of Congregational Christian Churches founded under the influence of New England Pilgrims and Puritans. Moreover, it also subsumed the third largest Calvinist group in the country, the German Reformed. The Evangelical and Reformed Church and the General Council of the Congregational Christian Churches united in 1957 to form the UCC. Church of Christ, Latter-day Saints. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was founded by Joseph Smith, often informally known as the LDS Church or Mormon Church, is a non-Trinitarian, Christian restorationist church that considers itself to be the restoration of the original church founded by Jesus Christ. The church is headquartered in the United States in Salt Lake City, Utah, and has established congregations and built temples worldwide. According to the church, it has over 16.6 million members and 51,000 full-time volunteer missionaries. The church is the fourth largest Christian denomination in the United States, with over 6.7 million members as of 2021, self-reported. It is the largest denomination in the Latter-day Saint movement founded by Joseph Smith during the early 19th century period of religious revival known as the Second Great Awakening. Church theology includes the Christian doctrine of salvation only through Jesus Christ, and the substitutionary atonement of Jesus Christ. The church has an open canon which includes 4 scriptural texts: the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. Other than the Bible, the majority of the church's canon consists of material the church's members believe to have been revealed by God to Smith. These include commentary and exegesis about the Bible, texts described as lost parts of the Bible, and other works believed to be written by ancient prophets, including the Book of Mormon. Pure Church of Christ. The Pure Church of Christ was the first known schismatic organization to emerge within the Latter-day Saint movement, LDS. The Pure Church of Christ was organized in 1831 in Kirtland, Ohio, by Wykeham Clark, Northrop Sweet, and 4 others who claimed that LDS founder Joseph Smith was a false prophet. They had a few meetings and soon disbanded. According to speeches made by George A. Smith that were recorded in the LDS Journal of Discourses, this church never had more than 6 members. According to George A. Smith, Wyman Clark was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, about the same time as Sidney Rigdon, mid or late 1830. Clark, another follower of Joseph Smith named Northrop Sweet, and 4 unnamed others were responsible for the creation of the Pure Church of Christ. At the time of the creation of the Pure Church of Christ in Kirtland, some Latter-day Saints founded a communal program inspired by the biblical book of Acts. About 50 people located on a farm owned by Isaac Morley had been baptized, but had not yet been instructed in relation to their duties under the collectivist arrangement. These people claimed that a spirit entered into them. Some claimed to see angels and other miraculous events were reported. Upon hearing of these events, Joseph Smith came to Kirtland to teach these saints that they were in error and how to distinguish between what he described as true and false spiritual manifestations. Clark rejected Smith's message, and further claimed he received a revelation that he was to be a prophet. Clark organized the Pure Church of Christ, and commenced having meetings and preaching. Church of Christ Whiteite. This denomination, founded by Lyman White in 1884, split from the Church of Christ Latter-day Saints at the death of Joseph Smith. Lyman White was an early leader in the Latter-day Saint movement. He was the leader of the Latter-day Saints in Daviess County, Missouri, in 1838. In 1841, he was ordained a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. After the death of Joseph Smith resulted in a succession crisis, White led his own break-off group of Latter-day Saints to Texas, where they created a settlement. While in Texas, White broke with the main body of the group led by Brigham Young. White was ordained president of his own church, but he later sided with the claims of William Smith, and eventually of Joseph Smith III. After his death, most of the Whiteites, as members of this church were called, joined with the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, RLDS Church. Church of Christ Temple Lot. The Church of Christ, informally called Hedrickites, and the Church of Christ Temple Lot, is a denomination of the Latter-day Saint movement headquartered in Independence, Missouri, on what is known as the Temple Lot. The nickname for members of the church comes from the surname of Granville Hedrick, who was ordained as the church's leader in July 1863. Unlike the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints (LDS Church) and Community of Christ, the Temple Lot Church rejects the office of prophet or president, being instead led by its quorum of 12 apostles. The Church also rejects the doctrines of baptism for the dead and celestial marriage promulgated by the Utah-based LDS Church, as well as the Doctrine and Covenants and Pearl of Great Price. While once avidly engaged in dialogue with other Latter-day Saint factions, the Church no longer has any official contact with any other organization. It is notable for its sole ownership of the Temple Lot, which it has held for nearly 150 years. As of 2013, membership is 7,310 members in 11 countries. Most of the members live in the United States, but there are parishes in Canada, Mexico, Honduras, Nigeria, Kenya, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Malawi, Tanzania, India, and the Philippines. Church of Christ Fettingite. The Church of Christ, informally referred to as the Fettingites, is a denomination within the Latter-day Saint movement which split from the Church of Christ, and formerly known as Hedrikites, in late 1929. The faction was formally established on April 8, 1930. Otto Fetting, an apostle in the Church of Christ, was the alleged recipient of a series of messages delivered by John the Baptist concerning construction of a temple on the Temple Lot, along with other aspects of Hedrikite doctrine and practice. The rejection of his 12th message, by a majority vote of his fellow apostles in October 1929 led to a split in the Temple Lot organization between those who rejected Fetting's messages and those who accepted them. The Fettingites subsequently established their own church organization. While Fettingite doctrine and practices are virtually identical to those of the Church of Christ, a significant difference exists today in the acceptance of the message's authenticity between Hedrikites and Fettingites. The Hedrikite leadership voted at their April 1936 conference to formally reject Otto Fetting's claim of having heard from John the Baptist, but some laity in the Hedrikite sect have informally expressed interest or belief in his claims, to where about a half dozen Hedrikites today believe Fetting received some or all of the revelations he claimed. After its founder's death in 1933, the Fettingite sect further divided into various factions, including the Church of Christ Restored, the Church of Christ at Haley's Bluff, and the Church of Christ with the Elijah Message. As with the Church of Christ, each of these groups declares itself to be the only true and living church upon the face of the whole earth. Church of Christ with Elijah Message. The Church of Christ with the Elijah Message is the name of three related church groups and a denomination of the Latter-day Saint movement, headquartered in Independence, Missouri. It split from the Church of Christ, informally referred to as the Fettingites, in 1943 in a dispute over claimed revelations given to its founder William A. Draves. Draves, an elder in the Fettingite group, claimed to be receiving messages from an angelic being who identified himself as John the Baptist, the same person who had allegedly appeared to Fettingite founder Otto Fetting, a former apostle of the Temple Lot Church of Christ. While many Fettingites accepted these new missives, some did not, leading Draves to form his own church. His adherents claim it to be the sole legitimate continuation of Fetting's organization, as well as that of the Temple Lot Church. As of 1987, the church had approximately 12,500 adherents spread between Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia and the Americas. Church of Christ Restored. The Church of Christ Restored is a denomination within the Latter-day Saint movement that split from the Church of Christ Fettingite in the late 1930s under the leadership of Elder A.C. DeWolf. The DeWolf faction refused to reconcile with the main body, considering itself to be the sole legitimate continuation of the Fettingite Church, and the only true church on earth today. Its membership is currently concentrated mostly in the American South, and stands at about 450 members. Church of Christ Whitmerite. The Church of Christ, informally referred to as the Church of Christ Whitmerite, was a denomination of the Latter-day Saint movement based on the claims of David Whitmer, one of the three witnesses to the Book of Mormon's golden plates. There were actually two separate organizations of this church. In 1847, William E. McClellan, who led a congregation of Latter-day Saints in Kirtland, Ohio, remembered that Joseph Smith, the movement's deceased founder, had designated David Whitmer as his successor. McClellan encouraged Whitmer to come forward and lead his church. Whitmer agreed and gathered others to his cause, including fellow Book of Mormon witnesses Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris, Hiram Page and John Whitmer. By the 1870s Whitmer was active again and had reorganized his Church of Christ. In 1887 he published his An Address to All Believers in Christ, which promoted his church and affirmed his testimony of the Book of Mormon. Whitmer died in 1888, but the Whitmerite Church continued on. Church of Christ Brewsterite. The Church of Christ was a schismatic sect from the Latter-day Saint movement that was founded in 1848 by James C. Brewster and Hazen Aldrich. Because of the church's belief that Brewster was a prophet, the group is often called the Brewsterites. The Church of Christ was a schismatic sect from the Latter-day Saint movement that was founded in 1848 by James C. Brewster and Hazen Aldrich. Because of the church's belief that Brewster was a prophet, the group is often called the Brewsterites. Churches of Christ in Europe. The Churches of Christ in Europe are Christian groups of autonomous congregations using the name Church of Christ, which may or may not have a historical association with the Restoration movement. These groups are characterized by an emphasis on basing doctrine and practice on the Bible alone in order to restore the New Testament church they believe to have been established by Jesus. Key features of the church's worship are the weekly observance of the Lord's Supper presided over by one or more of the men of the church, believers' baptism leading to salvation, and a cappella singing. The time in which the Churches of Christ in Central Europe began is not agreed upon. Some have said that the Churches of Christ began with the American Restoration movement. However, Hans Godwin Grimm, author of the book Tradition and History of the Early Churches of Christ in Central Europe, born in 1899, wrote that in March 1955 he met for the first time in his life a member of the Restored Churches of Christ of America. Grimm continued, saying, "What he had to tell me was not other than the faith of my ancestors which I had taught and practiced all my life. The American Restoration movement had been totally unknown to us. As a result of their different history and the influence of the Scottish Baptists, British Churches of Christ have, when compared to the American Restoration movement, placed a relatively greater emphasis on restoring the New Testament church than they have on unity." During the 1800s, the internal dialogue of the British churches was characterized more by rationalism than by evangelicalism. They put greater emphasis on convincing adherents of other churches than on converting non-Christians. In the early 20th century, they became more open to ecumenism. By the 1960s, relatively few ministers of the British Churches of Christ had a conservative, evangelical approach to theology. By the 1980s, strong allegiance to restorationism was limited to the a cappella congregations. In the early 1800s, Scottish Baptists were influenced by the writings of Alexander Campbell in the Christian Baptist and Millennial Harbinger. A group in Nottingham withdrew from the Scotch Baptist Church in 1836 to form a Church of Christ. James Wallace, a member of that group, founded a magazine named the British Millennial Harbinger in 1837. In 1842, the first cooperative meeting of Churches of Christ in Great Britain was held in Edinburgh. Approximately 50 congregations were involved, representing a membership of 1,600. The name, Churches of Christ, was formally adopted at an annual meeting in 1870. Alexander Campbell influenced the British Restoration movement indirectly through his writings. He visited Britain for several months in 1847, and presided at the second cooperative meeting of the British churches at Chester. At that time the movement had grown to encompass 80 congregations with a total membership of 2,300. Annual meetings were held after 1847. The use of instrumental music in worship was not a source of division among the Churches of Christ in Great Britain before World War I. More significant was the issue of pacifism. A national conference was established in 1916 for congregations that opposed the war. A conference for Old Paths congregations was first held in 1924. The issues involved included concern that the Christian Association was compromising traditional principles in seeking ecumenical ties with other organizations and a sense that it had abandoned Scripture as an all-sufficient rule of faith and practice. 2. Old Paths congregations withdrew from the association in 1931. An additional 2 withdrew in 1934, and 19 more withdrew between 1943 and 1947. Membership declined rapidly during and after the First World War. The Association of Churches of Christ in Britain disbanded in 1980. Most association congregations, approximately 40, united with the United Reformed Church in 1981. In the same year, 24 other congregations formed a Fellowship of Churches of Christ. The fellowship developed ties with the Christian churches and Churches of Christ during the 1980s.